Now, what I want to introduce into this conversation as we move forward in this crucial year 2010, that it is critically important that we insert into all our conversations the notion of justice. And that is why, for example, Kofi Annan, in the run-up to Copenhagen, joined with us, together with a range of people, to actually insert into our development discourse the notion of climate justice, for example. I mean, we talk about gender justice and so on, but when we think about climate justice, just very quickly, it is patently wrong and unjust that men and women in countries that have been least responsible for the climate chaos that we find ourselves in now, not tomorrow, because 300,000 people are dying now from climate impacts. We have thousands of climate refugees in Bangladesh and Africa now, and we already now can see how climate change is driving up conflict. For example, even when you look at the genocide in Darfur, when you look at that, you can see it simply as an ethnic conflict, but the major driver of that genocide is water scarcity and land scarcity, and the water scarcity in particular is a result of climatic impacts that are happening now. Lake Chad was one of the largest inland seas in the world that neighbors Darfur. It's virtually dried up as a result of climatic impacts. But it is tragic that even those citizens from those countries who have been least responsible are the ones that are paying the first and most brutal price. So when we think about all that we're doing, about the need to reform governance institutions, the need to have a new discourse that actually begins to set us on a very radical, different path to create a sustainable world, these are tough choices that need to be made, and I must sadly say that too many of our political leaders are strangled by short-term election cycles and short-term political expediency, and are not willing to actually be honest with themselves to say, folks, we are in a real mess, we cannot continue as usual, and we need to actually fundamentally introduce new thinking. And some of the new thinking is not that new. We've been talking from civil society about the need for a financial transactions tax, which is called the Tobin tax in some places and so on, which would mobilize billions of dollars by just taxing the flow of currencies across borders. We've been talking about closing the tax havens which allow corporations to behave with impunity and to escape the tax obligations, billions of dollars that get wasted and disappear because we are not willing to make some decisions that upset certain powerful lobbies in the private sector. So within all of this context, let's look at the moment then where we are in 2010. This is a fundamentally important year. And the most reason it is fundamental is because for the first time, the World Cup in football comes to Africa, in South Africa, in June, July. But apart from the World Cup coming to Africa for the first time, the MDG conference takes place in September at the United Nations. It's 10 years since the majority of the heads of state gathered at the Millennium Summit and formulated the Millennium Declaration. That was a moment of optimism and hope and encouragement that by 2015 we would not eradicate poverty, but at least we would halve it through certain specific measures. And I'm sad to say that even though there has been progress in many places, many of the goals are not near achievement. In some parts of the world, particularly in the last 2 years, we've seen a slippage in those goals. And now is a time for us, in the remaining months leading up to the September summit, is to do three things. One is, we as a civil society community have to begin to say, what do we need to say differently, what do we need to do differently, and how do we ensure that that summit is not just another talking shop, but it's one where we can recover momentum to ensure in the remaining 5 years to 2015 and beyond that we can actually get on a serious path of addressing poverty. Because the bottom line is, if there is political will, we can see how resources can be mobilized. And let me say, it's not just about rich country governments. Even when we look at our governments in Africa, and, for example, when it comes to military expenditure, right, governments in rich and poor countries seem to have this very much in common. And that is, even though they can complain and ask for aid and do all of these things, but when it comes to the issue of conflict and mobilizing resources to acquire weapons of war, it seems that there is a magical political will and ability to be able to mobilize the scale of financing, the scale of the financing, which is unimaginable even to address poverty in rich parts of the world. And that has to change. The second thing we have to do is to begin to say, now is the time for us to say we cannot wait any longer. Because every delay we have, the consequences and the costs are increasing astronomically. Just to give you a few examples. The International Energy Association, for example, and backed up by the British economist and former World Bank chief economist Nicholas Stern, have said that every year we delay getting a fair, ambitious, and legally binding treaty in terms of climate, the cost goes up by at least $500 million more every year of delay. And we know that with particularly the linkage now between climate change and poverty, that in fact many of the impacts of climate change are deepening poverty, exacerbating poverty, but also reversing some of the successes that we've had in places like Bangladesh because of climatic impacts. And the sad truth is, some of this is totally irreversible, right? We're not going to get some of the glaciers back. We're not going to seriously reverse desertification in northern Kenya. I can give you any number of examples, by the way, not only in the developing world, but also in the developed world, where in fact some of the climate impacts are already irreversible. So when we have our leaders, as we had in Copenhagen, coming there with the message of urgency and so on, and they're not delivering, we have to begin to ask ourselves a key question about the quality of governance that we actually are dealing with. And I will just spend a few minutes with that and then begin to conclude. Some of you might remember in the 1980s, there was a slogan that said, think globally, act locally. How many of you, just a show of hands? Okay, quite a few of you. What we understood by that slogan, which actually emerged at the time of the Rio Earth Summit in the early 1990s, was that irrespective of the issue or challenge that you were trying to address at the local or national level, you needed to think more deeply and more analytically about how the issue that you were trying to tackle at the national, local level was being impacted on by global processes, global institutions, and global thinking. And that was fine. And then suddenly, the Berlin Wall came down, and suddenly there was this promise of democracy and economic progress and so on, which we're all excited about. And then suddenly that slogan didn't quite work for people in developing countries, because they began to say, hang on a minute, if you think globally and we act solely locally, and if actually in the post-Berlin Wall period, actually real power on many things are shifting from the national to the global levels, because today you cannot, even if every African political leader was ethical, anti-corrupt, efficient, and so on, right? Assume that, right? That every African leader is like, a combination of, Mahatma Gandhi and, Jesus Christ and, a range of other religious leaders in one. Still, they won't be able to deliver development to the people because the trade policies are unjust and they have virtually no control over it. Even addressing an issue like HIV/AIDS, because the pricing of life-saving pharmaceutical drugs, right, is not determined at the national level. It's determined through an organization called the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. And even addressing HIV/AIDS cannot be seen as a solely national issue, because those drugs are critically important to save lives of people who are HIV positive. Of course, the environment cannot be seen as a national issue, and just in the last 2 years we've had bird flu, what's the other one? Swine flu and various other diseases that clearly don't respect visas and national boundaries.